So in the last video, you got a small taster here when we did this for each of live templates. And live templates basically allow you to type shorthand, which creates code for you based on templates. If we actually go to settings, so Control Alt S, and if we look at live templates down here, in fact, no, let's practice the Shift and type live templates. So we're practicing this discoverability. So we can see here, we found it here, and that's gone straight to it. If we go to C#, then we can see we've got like a long list of predefined templates. So if we go to the for, if we can find that, and click on here, we can see, oh no, for each. We'll look at, this looks more complicated, we'll look at that in a sec. For each, oh actually this looks quite similar. So we can see we've got these things like type, variables, collections, selection, end. So let's break this down a bit. If we click on variables over here, then this shows those variables. And those are basically whatever you type into here. I could type $foo, and then edit variables, and it would appear there. I can then do change macro, and there's a whole bunch of macros around different things you can do. So for this one, it would start doing a code completion. We can insert things like the solution name. There's even somewhere a clipboard, so you can insert the clipboard content. So there's a whole bunch of things you can automatically do as part of your template. So let's cancel that and then close this. The end is basically where the cursor will end once it's created that code. And then these variables, you just tab through each one. So let's look at for each again. So think about where end is and think about these three variables. So if I do for each and then tab, so whatever you call those variables will be here as placeholders. And you can see because the macro that I showed you said trigger the autocomplete, then that's why this has popped up automatically. So let's choose items. And then I can tab again to go to the next variable. I don't want to change that, so I'm happy with the default for that one. Tab again. I will change this to item, which it's worked out for me, so I'll press down and enter. And you can see how once it's finished that, it's ended up here, which if I do Control-Shift-Alt again, we can see that's where the end is. This is actually if, but if you remember, I won't find it now, but the for each also had an end. The for each also had a selection. What the selection does is, and you can see here, this is using generation, surround, or both. So the selection is about the surround. So what that means is, if I cancel this, and then let's delete that. Let's also delete these two and this. Now you may notice as I'm doing this, like little things I'm doing which aren't really about what we're talking about, like deleting those lines. I'm actually using a Vim plugin, and I'll talk more about plugins later on in the course. But if you're seeing this being a block as I'm doing demonstrations, or me quickly doing things like deleting those lines, that's just Vim. But I'll make sure that doesn't affect the thing I'm demoing. So for here, the thing I'm demoing is the live templates, which aren't related to Vim. So if I select that now, so that's highlighted. And to discover what the shortcut is, if you do Shift and type surround, then we can see surround with live template. So we can see that's Control E and U in my case. So escape that. So if I do Control E and U, then it's popped up this, because obviously when something's selected, I can't start typing that shortcut. Like for example, for each, I'm typing a shortcut, then pressing tab, but I can't do that when something's selected. So for here, I've got to use a shortcut like EU. And then it's showing me all the live templates that support surround. So let's do try actually. So that's wrapped it in a try block. And we can see we're still doing the variable replacement, so I can tab through those and change those. If I tab again, it's taking me to there. So it's taking me from there to there. Tab again. And that will be wherever the end is. But this block will be, if we find that try, selection. So selection is replaced with whatever your selection was when you trigger this surround. And again, here is where we specify whether a template is a surround template. Both obviously is surround as well. So for example, in the case of, well, in this one or for each, you don't have to have a selection, but it supports it. And just like I showed in the last video for the save, you can do this and you can choose whether it's saving for this solution personally. So a file that's in gitignore, I believe that will have like .user. In the file name. And there's a shared one which would be in Git in source control, so you can share these options and templates with your team. So now let's create our own and find a real world use case where this can save us a lot of time. You've probably already heard of this, but Jimmy Bogart's Mediator library, which I quite like. So let's just scroll down and let's go for some examples. I'm not going to explain what this does. This is out of scope of what I'm showing here, but let's just scroll down. As part of using Mediator, you'd want to create a request class that implements iRequest. Also a handler that implements iRequest handler. So let's just use this as an example. Say you're using Mediator quite heavily and you want to be creating lots of handlers. If I copy this now and then go back to Rider, and let's click this plus button to create our own. And I'm just going to say handler. So this is the shortcut that you start typing. And let's go Mediator handler. I could do it as a surround, but for this, let's keep it simple. You can choose availability, so we can choose what languages it's for and various things. But let's start with that. And then in here, I'm going to paste that code in. So that was from the Mediator documentation. So things we want to replace in here, for example, ping. So let's create a variable. Let's just call it rectype. And let's copy that. And let's replace ping here for rectype and here. Let's delete this, and I'm going to say end. So that's where we want the cursor to end. So I think that's okay. So if I do save, so now let's just go down here. If I type handler and then tab, it's done that for us. And we can see that it's highlighted the rect type, so we can call that whatever we wanted. And I can see I've made a mistake here, like ping is still there. So let's just delete that and fix that up. So handler. So I didn't want ping here, so that was a mistake. And then save, and then let's do handler again, enter. So imagine this handler is getting products. So let's type get products. And we can see that's replaced both instances in one go because it was the same variable name, and it's left me in the middle where that end was. So you can see how this is going to be really, really powerful. Imagine a team that uses Mediator very heavily to quickly be able to create templates or whatever library it is, not just Mediator, it's whatever it is you use. Or even if you're sharing templates, custom templates with your team, it might be within your own code base. There's lots of patterns that your team repeats that you want to set up templates for. You might have very custom shareable templates. So you can see how if you build up a library of these templates for your team's code base, how powerful and how much time something like this might save. There's also another option called postfix completion. And what this does is, say I've got foo, for example, I could do foo.null, this is an example, or not null, and then tab, and then that auto completes. So this postfix completion is where you start typing a word and you can do something. So I could do foo. If I scroll down to the bottom, we can see what I could be doing. So let's try for each, and items will be a better demonstration. So if we do items.forEach and then tab, then again, it's a very similar kind of thing, but it just allows you to do a dot and then the completion. If we do shift and then type postfix completion, so because I've searched for it, it's graying out everything that doesn't match that search. So if I do the X and then that's not grayed out, but note that this only has TypeScript and JavaScript in the list. So don't think at the moment for C# we can create custom postfix completions. In fact, there is this support ticket about this. It's down as nice to have. If I scroll down, like 10 months ago, we've got people saying we still need this. So JetBrains, if you're listening, this will be really handy. And in the next video, we're going to be looking at bookmarks because that can also be a massive time saving. And it's one of those things that I very rarely see other people use. So in this video, we're going to talk about bookmarks. Now, I personally think that bookmarks are a highly underutilized bit of functionality in the IDE, not just Rider, but any IDEs. I work with a lot of developers, and I've very rarely seen anyone use bookmarks, if ever. So this project I created for the next module when we talk about debugging, so I'll be using this a lot in the next module, but I thought this would be quite useful to demo bookmarks too. And quite often when you're working with a code base, because quite often you're doing full stack development, you might be working on a feature and you might be doing something on a front end view, on some HTML, and that might call into an API, a web API in the same solution, another project. So you've got a controller, which then might call into a service, which might call into something, other layers. You'll have tests as well. So quite often when you're working, you're jumping between these different locations, and a lot of developers don't realize this, but this wastes a lot of time. It takes a lot of cognitive load, which you might not realize is happening, to find the other areas as you're switching backwards and forwards, where bookmarks can really help with that. So just quickly, I'm going to introduce this project more in the next module, but basically it's a web API project. So we've got a controller. The controller has two endpoints, which calls into a podcast service, a couple of methods in here. This also then calls into a podcast source, which is an interface, and we have one implementation, which is a hard-coded list. So I've intentionally got these different layers, so the controller, the service, a podcast source, because in the next module when I talk about debugging, I want to show the call stack, which shows a call hierarchy. So that's why I've done it this way, but this will work as a good example for bookmarks too, because I've got a test here as well. So this is just an integration test. So imagine this is my project, and the feature I'm working on, I'm touching all these different things. If I go to the controller, and as part of this work, I'm jumping backwards to this controller because I'm working with it. The starting point for bookmarks for shortcuts is Control K, and you'd follow that with another character depending on what you want to do. So to toggle a bookmark, Control KK. And you can see on the left-hand side in the gutter, there's this bookmark. If I press Control KK again, it'll go away. So that's a toggle. If you do Control KW, that pops up this window, and this is like a list of your bookmarks. And you can rename this by pressing the F2 key. So what my workflow tends to be, I would do KK, KW, and then F2 to rename that. So I can call this something like controller. Now it's worth pointing out that I tend to use bookmarks very temporarily. So I would give it a very vague name like controller. If I go to the tests and say the functionality I'm working with this test, I can just do KK, KW, F2, and then test. So that takes me to my test very quickly. Say the podcast source, and let's do the actual implementation. Say I'm working with this data quite a bit. Maybe this is an anti-framework call or something, and I'm jumping backwards and forwards to this. I can then do KK, KW to get that list up, and F2. So this can be data. So then when I'm working, I can very quickly jump around. So say I want to jump to my tests, I can do KW, down to tests, enter, and I'm there. Say I want to jump back to the controller, I can do KW. I can even start typing controller, then enter. Then say I want to go to the data, KW, type data. It was already there, enter, and it's gone to the data. So I can jump to where I want to go without much thought. Whereas if I'm having to control tab, oh, which one was it? Where was it? Or if I've not got the tab open even, I've got to start finding it. I know you've got shift, so I can find it fairly easily there. I can do tests. So that shift is very helpful. But just having these bookmarks, you can very quickly jump between. You've also got a pin for this. So if you do Alt and 2, this pops this up. Or you can find it here. If it's not visible, it'll be in this list. And we can expand this, and we can see, if we expand it again, we can see those named bookmarks. So if you want these up all the time, maybe you're more of a mouse person, so you just want to be able to click on it, then maybe this is the better option to have open. One thing I would change, you can see these are nested under the files. If you do this ... and you turn off group line bookmarks by file, then especially if you've named the bookmarks, I personally think this is a much nicer view where you've got the names so you can jump between the different places. And with a real project, you might have a lot more bookmarks. This is just a very small example. You can also, with this plus, you can create a bookmark list. So where I said that I use these quite temporarily, maybe you don't want to, maybe you want to actually store bookmarks in different places in your code base and have them more permanent. If you click this, you can give it a name. I can't think of a suitable name at the moment, so I'm just going to do foo. And I can drag these into that grouping. I can also right click and make that the default list. If it's the default list, if I add a new one, KK, then that's going to appear in the default one. And if I do Control KW, you'll see that's the one that's expanded and this is collapsed. And that's really useful if you do want to have different groupings of bookmarks. So if I delete that and delete that one. So that's it for bookmarks, and also marks the end of this module. In the next module, we're going to be doing a deep dive in how to debug in Rider.